Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's FSR online debate on new trends in electricity regulation, the case of the EU. My name is Marta Cesini from the Florence School of Regulation, where I usually focus on gas networks. So today I'm the honorary member of the electrons team, a cousin from the molecule side of the family. I will moderate the discussion today. So the EU electricity sector is evolving quickly to a dynamic, decentralized, and increasingly consumer-driven system. Regulation have to evolve just as quickly, so I'm thrilled to have four outstanding experts here to guide us through the major shifts and innovation in electricity regulation. We will begin with three short interventions from Christine Bradstad, Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure, Copenhagen Business School. Hello, Christine.
Hi.
Hi. Then we will have Team Shitekate, FTI Consulting and Florence School of Regulation. Hello, team.
Hello, thank you for
Hello.
having me.
And finally, we have Nicolo Rossetto from the Florence School of Regulation. Hello, Nicolo.
Buongiorno.
Each will share their insights from their contribution to the new handbook on electricity regulation edited by Jean-Michel Glachin, Paul Yosko, and Michael Pollitt. You have the link to the book on the FSR webpage of the event if you would like to check it out. Then Nico Kayers, policy officer at Acer, will offer his perspective. And then hello, Nico, sorry. And finally, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience in the second part of the session, so you can really join the conversation with our speakers. Feel free to start using the Q&A box at any time during the webinar. We will get to the question, as I said, in the second part, and we will try to answer as many as possible. So let me now hand over to our three speakers who will each share their insights in about 8 minutes. First, we have Christine. Please, Christine.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be sharing with you in a very brief manner the insights from one of the chapters. I think it's chapter 5 of this new handbook on electricity regulation. You can see the title here, Regulated Distribution Sector Facing the Future. So we're trying to anticipate somehow or make sense of what's happening in Europe. And this is a chapter that I wrote together with Jean-Michel Glachin, who's also the editor. So you should see this as a collaborative work. And now let's see. I want to highlight or just give you some brief insights into essentially three things. First of all, we have a bit of a more conceptual perspective where we look at different layers of what we consider or what we coin as radical changes that are happening in the distribution sector. And we've put it in this diagram here where we have the core of it being technology, which is, of course, not really working or functioning by itself, but instead we need some kind of layer of business models around it. And these business models also cannot really work just out of themselves. They need a framework around them, some transactional arrangements which allow them to be viable business models. And all of this is then framed by regulation, by public policies, and some behind-the-meter activities of those who are actually shaping the usage of this energy system. So let's look a bit more in detail what we mean there. So technological innovations in the distribution sector that drive these radical changes. On the one hand, some type of new grid uses. We can think of electric vehicles, think of data centers so long as they're connected at distribution level, and all kinds of new uses. It could also be distributed generation feeding into the grid, things that hadn't really been part of the picture when 2 decades ago, distribution systems had been planned, and now they have to function with these new uses. And importantly, especially if we're integrating volatile renewables, we're also talking about new uses that are flexible and then can potentially either react themselves or be planned around some things. Along with that also come smart meters that are integrated into the grid. And as we also need more grids, a larger capacity in the grids, we're also talking increasingly about grid enhancing technologies. So new types of grid technology, which can make the grid more efficient and therefore handle capacity demand better or more cheaply than just building new lines and cables everywhere. So all those are technological innovations that we already see or that are offered in the energy system that need to be or could potentially be integrated into the electricity system. As I said, they don't work by themselves. They need new business models. And some parts of new business models that we see are, for example, utilities that are contracting for energy efficiency or that want to offer some kind of energy services rather than just supplying energy. We see actors aggregating grid use and managing flexibility of these new technologies, of these new users. This requires that some party in the distribution system handles large amount of data. Also, this data needs to be provided. And then we see some new governance structures, energy communities, and local trading. All of this somehow should be, or ideally could be, transformed into a viable, feasible type of business. And for this to work, we're also looking into new transactional agreements that could, at the very simplest level, be different, more sophisticated and more dedicated tariffs for grid use. It could also be, and we see some instances where there's contracts for control of these new technologies, so some kind of influence on how to use electric vehicles, on how to dispatch distributed generation. This could also be part of a procurement platform. It could be in the shape of contracting capacity to be flexible or other types of flexibility products. And as I will discuss when we get to the cases, there's also evidence of limited or delayed connections, which essentially you can also frame as a transactional agreement. Since all of this is happening in a regulated space, in a natural monopoly space, this also needs to translate into changes in the network regulation. And there, for example, we're looking at a shift away from the networks just being required to be ever more efficient, but instead also justifying some kind of cost increase, which comes with these changes and with innovations. I think Nicolo is going to get to that later on. There's some shift from investments and things that are happening that are very capex intensive versus other things which will also increase and affect itself in the operational frame. There's incentives for innovation, which I'm not going to look into too much. And then there's also a large push for what we call non-monetized benefits. So integrating renewables, security of supply, and all these kinds of things need to be part of the regulation, but they don't really translate easily into a euro value per kilowatt hour provided. So there we also see a lot of changes, and this goes along with public energy and decarbonization policies. So general pathways that are outlined for the energy transition, things like electrification plans, planning for heating and cooling, and also the shift of industrial processes towards more decarbonized things. All of this eventually will also affect itself in the distribution system. And as a last but really not least element in this radical change, there's also a significant change ever so slowly manifesting in what we call behind the meter activities. So consumer decisions on, say, investments, on which technologies they use and how they consume their energy are not the same as they were 10, 20 years ago, partially because of the other elements that we see, because they now have different incentives, because they have new technological options. But essentially, that also means that consumers are ever more empowered to influence and be an active part of how this energy system, how this distribution system is evolving in the future. So since we see changes and shifts in all of these layers, and obviously they're not happening independently, we think and we coin that there is a transformation happening at the distribution level. And in the chapter, we also discuss two cases, and we coin them. I think this could be contested by someone, but in any case, that's the way we chose to look at it, that we have different states of urgency. And we, on the one hand, look at the case of Germany, where we could see that there are sort of incremental changes happening over the last years. This happened maybe 10 years ago, I don't remember exactly when they started to shift away from dimensioning the grid for any kind of renewable infeed, but sort of putting a stop to that and saying the very last peaks of renewable volatile generation, we don't really need the grid to be ready to take that up all the time. So there was a change in regulation where they said, as a generator, you can only really rely on and have a claim to have 97% of your energy transmitted. This was sort of one first step to deal with this new system. We also see and have seen a trend there that network operators have increased the fixed network tariff components in their system. And this was seen partially as a response to self-supply, sort of to help or prevent that cost would be socialized, could no longer be socialized if consumers were able to avoid energy withdrawals from the grid. There's also been some efforts of demonstrations and sandboxes for flexibility markets, establishing some kind of platforms where flexibilities that are emerging in the system can be coordinated and traded. And lastly, I think last year, finally, this process ended and there was new legislation passed, which now makes variable network tariffs for controllable loads possible. So this is a sort of a story of incremental small changes which help the DSOs or some kind of entity in the distribution system to manage the grid access and grid usage without really challenging the premise that that there should ideally be grid access and a universal and ideally, if possible, unlimited type of grid access for everybody. And we contrast this to a story in the Netherlands where the challenge is just that much bigger now. I think you've all seen this, or not, maybe you haven't all seen, but many people in the sector currently have seen this map of the Netherlands where large parts are red, signaling that actually no new consumers or generators can connect there in the near future. And that sort of puts them in a position where these small changes are maybe not enough now. They have to sort of do something bigger, do something more radical.
Christine?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Maybe you're referring to the next slide. We still see slide 2. I don't know.
No, I chose not to show the map. I'm just
okay.
evoking the picture of the map.
Okay.
But
okay.
thanks. That was also to limit myself to not talk too much about it. Let me now recollect myself. So some things that we see there, as opposed to this sort of small changes in Germany, is that we already have some voluntary bilateral capacity limitation contracts where you can say, well, I'm happy to reduce my requirement for grid capacity. There's also some new entity, which is the congestion management service provider. So someone who's really in charge of handling the capacity, and there's like a formalized role for that in the network tariffs. There's specific requirements for network operators to increase capacity if they are also engaging in congestion management, and this should free up to a maximum of 150% of the previous capacity, so 50% more because we now have management. And they've introduced non-firm connection agreements, and also they are thinking, I'm not sure actually if this has been passed now, to increase the grid tariffs for this existing unlimited network use, so that the standard should become a type of reduced, more economic grid tariff for non-firm or group contracts or something. And this all together can then, in contrast, be seen as a pivot away from this universal and unlimited grid access towards a new regime where we can be more creative and more agile with the way users are accessing the grid. And I believe the next presentation by Tim is probably going to give some insights more specifically on how this could look like. And with this, I'm going to wrap up from our chapter. We try to anticipate what the future of distribution systems look like. Of course, we also don't know. It's a bit of a crystal ball. But to wrap it up, we sort of postulate that there's different, if you want, institutional influences as to where we're headed. And because Europe is so heterogeneous, it's very likely that we're also not going to end up in one uniform distribution future in Europe. But depending on where the different countries and systems are at right now, they're likely to evolve into a bit of a different direction in parallel as well. And this could, for example, depend on what kind of mix of assets for decarbonization, both generation, but new consumers as well, are favored in a certain national context. It also will likely depend on political and economic strength of the players behind the meter. So if you have very flexible, but also very agile and very ready to interact users in your network system, this certainly will affect what kind of interactions and management you can do with them. There's also some path dependency as to what type of national distribution grid we have. We have some countries with very centralized distribution sectors and others with a lot of scattered distribution operators as well. And then we'll also see how new actors in the transformation evolve. And this could be aggregators to aggregate or bundle and facilitate flexibility. It could be platforms on which flexible products can be traded. And it can also be sort of local organizations, local governance structures, such as energy communities. And the mix of all these things, probably plus some other stuff, is going to be decisive for the distribution sector in Europe in the future. And with that, thank you from my side. If you want to know more, you will have to read the chapter after all. And I'm going to give over to Tim to talk more about.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Thank you very much, Christine. So next up is, as you said, Tim. Tim, please.
Thank you. So I'll share my slides. Let's see if I manage here. Okay, I think I'm going to put a big screen now. You should see it, right?
Is almost there. Yes, now we see it. Thank you,
Okay,
Tim.
thank you very much. So thank you for having me. And yeah, I had the honor to write chapter 14 in the handbook, which covers, I mean, similar topics like Christine. There's many sort of points we touch upon, but maybe the sort of angle it's a bit different. The chapter is regulating European distribution systems to achieve net zero, which is kind of a very ambitious title, because that means for the next 20 years or so, how DSOs would evolve, or how distribution would evolve. And I focus on tapping flexibility. So first, I start the chapter with basically underlining what kind of a big challenge this is. When you look at latest numbers from Acer, and I think Nico, who's here, was part of writing those reports, you can see that the amount of spend in network is expected to drastically increase. That's mostly because of electrification at distribution level, but of course also to connect networks at transmission level and connect a lot of renewables. But overall, the sort of spend on a per megawatt hour basis is expected to increase by 50-60% or so. And that's per megawatt hour basis, because the megawatt hours are also expected to increase, right? So the euros are expected to increase more than just 60% or so. As I already said, 2/3 of that is expected to happen at distribution level. If we look today at the electricity bills of the average European consumer, who doesn't exist, but still it's a good metric, then you can see that today about grid tariffs is about 1/3, a bit less than 1/3 in the classic electricity bill, like the ones that you and I pay. And if you see that trend and you imagine that everything else remains equal, that means that network costs are expected to be 50-60% of the bill, maybe in 2035 or so. So what we have to do is really think about how can we find that right balance between leveraging flexibility and building networks. It's pretty clear that we need to build networks, but the question is how much? And how much networks we have to build is a function of how we actually use those networks, right? So how do we develop tools to efficiently or mechanisms to efficiently coordinate the users, which could be consumers, could be storage, could be generation, with networks or network plans, network developments, right? And in the chapter, I explain sort of 3 broad mechanisms which can be used. The first one is the network access tariff, the way we actually pay for the network, because there's something to be said about sending some signals through the tariff design. I think many countries in Europe have really sort of been lagging in that regard. And even though Europe is actually winning the race at sort of international level, in the US, it's way worse. Maybe Australia is a bit better. But we really have to evolve in moving towards some capacity-based, time-varying tariff, moving maybe to dynamic volumetric tariffs. That is explained there. And Nico has also written the Acer report recently, what been published, explaining best practices. We've also published a report for Smart 10 with FTI, really focusing on that. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit, even though it's a big political challenge. Like, how much can you change the network tariff, and you make some winners and losers, and it's hard to do. But if you don't do it, then you're just going to pay and end up paying more. So that's a low-hanging fruit. Then there's other more sophisticated mechanisms, and I think Christine already touched upon them as well. Sort of smart connection agreements, where you can say, especially relevant to sort of renewables at medium voltage level or so, maybe you don't need to be able to export your power all the time. Maybe you're okay to get some curtailment 10, 15% of the time, and maybe that can save out 50% of the network cost that would have incurred if you want it 100%, right? And similar for consumers, maybe you don't need to have access. If you have some behind the meter technology, maybe you don't need to have 100% service level. Maybe you do, but then at least pay a bit more for it. These are those sort of smart connection agreements. And then local flexibility markets, which is where actually there's an active procurement of flexibility at local level. I think everybody knows the GoPacs, the Eneras, the Piccolo Flex, all those which are in full development. These ones can actually then sort of pick up the, let's say, peaks that cannot be solved by the other two tools. So these tools are definitely not substitutes for each other, rather complements. But it is, for me, quite dangerous to only rely on those flexibility markets, because there is some incentive compatibility issue with baselines and other things. So you really need to have enough competition at local level and so on. So I discussed those developments in Europe, which I think Europe is, they could have done better, but they're probably better than the rest of the world, with the exception of Australia, perhaps. And then I dive deeper into these local flex markets, which is basically bringing markets to the local level to procure for flexibility, then for mostly for like grid issues, right? So it's a thermal constraints, voltage constraints, or other types of issues. And then I say that, yeah, but to really have those local markets operated or facilitated by DSOs or by third parties, are DSOs ready for that kind of job as market facilitator? Christine already talked about it. In some countries, and there's one big country in the center of Europe that I'm not going to name the name, there are a massive amount of distribution system operators. I don't think it makes sense to have that many if you really try to invent like new tasks. And now I'm not making myself very popular, but there is definitely an argument for some more consolidation across those system operators. And then there's a question around their own governance. Like right now, in most countries other than the Netherlands, I think it's the only exception in Europe, and there's New Zealand, I think, in the rest of the world, that has actually ownership unbundled DSOs, which is here model 2. But most of the DSOs are legally unbundled, especially in Southern Europe, the Endesas, Enels, Iberdrolas, and others. Those are companies that own generation. And within this same holding, they also own a lot of networks. And I think, and I don't want to call these companies out, it happens everywhere, it happens in Germany as well. But I think there's some thinking around whether that is still fit for purpose when you actually have on one side a grid operator, DSO, that is actually creating demand for flexibility. And on the other hand, a mother company that potentially can compete to provide that supply. So there are questions around that. That's exactly the same debate that happens at transmission level 15 years ago, where the TSOs created balancing markets, and then suddenly they were asked to unbundle as well. That has been a massive fight up to most countries right now having ownership unbundled. Some have that model here, what they call the EDO, in some countries. So you see there's different ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be ownership unbundled. There are pro and cons. You lose some synergies if you do ownership unbundling. There's some impacts on financing, but it's definitely had to be rethought, and it will be even more tricky at distribution level than at transmission level, because it's just more money involved, more actors, and more local politics. But this is something that will have to go through, or we're just gonna spend more than we have to when fully developing and rolling out those mechanisms. The last point that I make in the chapter is that when you think about now, so far I only talked about distribution level, but basically what we see more and more is assets at distribution level that also participate in so-called transmission level markets, if you want. Via aggregators, they participate in the wholesale market, they participate potentially in redispatch, in balancing, and so on. But at the same time, you have different platforms that are created at local level that ask for that flexibility. That is that whole debate about TSO, DSO coordination. I'm not going to bring you an answer today because it's extremely complicated. But what I think, if there's one asset at local level that can get competed for to supply in different markets by different actors, it might require some reorganization of the different tasks of the system operator, among reorganization among voltage levels. And here I'm really talking post 2035 or so. This is not something for the next 5 years or whatever, but in a future state where you really have that sort of seamless or a lot of activity at local level. First of all, try to make the market do as much as possible. I mean, I have a strong stance on reflecting local constraints within energy markets, but then of course, there's also a lot of system services that still need to be developed. And in the chapter, I explain there's sort of two directions you can go to. Or you have one super system operator that centralizes that whole system operation of the whole system, let's say at national level or at regional level, because you can have multiple SOs next to each other geographically. Or you go the other way, where you really have an entity that resolves everything at local level, everything. So also a sort of distribution balancing, if you want, of course, very well coordinated with the transmission level. And then you have that strong coordination with the system operator, but you sort of reorganize some of those tasks. And I argue in the chapter that there's pro and cons for either. And that's something to be seen, whether we go to the left or to the right. But I think there is at least some thinking to be done in 10 years or so on how to reorganize those tasks in order not to have inefficient allocation of those resources that come with more local market activity. So these are not concrete solutions. These are really just thinking forward on the sort of walls we will be hitting if we don't change anything to the current organization. And I think that's it from my end.
Thank you, Ting. Thank you for the warning and for the forward-looking. Very, very interesting. I see some analogy with the gas networks here. But let's move on to Nicolas. Please, Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marzia. And the work I'm going to present is chapter 17 of the book, so comes a little bit after the one of theme, and also in my case is a joint work with our director, Leonardo Meus. And in this chapter, and I think it fits well the storyline of this debate, we reflect about the ability or not of network companies to innovate. I think that Christine and Tim already made sufficiently clear the case that business as usual in the electricity network business is not really an option, because with the huge increase in system needs, if we continue to do the same thing as in the past, we are going to see an escalation of costs, and probably we are definitely going to be late. At the same time, saying that we need innovation in networks can raise some eyebrows, because network companies, as regulated monopolies, are sometimes accused not to be really big innovators. They are often considered a bit backward-looking entities in a sense. And if you think in abstract terms, there can be some reasons for that. First, they are monopolies, and the first benefit, the first profits of being a monopolist is that if you like, you can enjoy a quiet life. You do not need to really struggle to change everything every day. But of course, also there is this idea that given the nature of the service that creates support, well, it's natural that there is a big concern with security of supply, with continuity of the service. And so if you need to ensure that, probably you want to be on the safe side. inevitably it's a business that can promote risk aversion. That's why some people claim that network companies are not really innovators. But our question, one of the questions that we address in the chapter is, are we sure that this is the case? Well, to answer that, maybe we need to think a little bit about what is innovation, because there is a story in the literature addressing this issue of innovation in networks. Sometimes results are not easy to summarize, also because innovation is not a simple concept, is rather broad. It can concern products, processes, methods, and so on. It's not trivial to measure it. You can use some proxies, like the number of patents submitted by a certain actor, but they are, of course, only proxies. And then innovation can have different effects. So some innovations can be more easily captured by the innovator, and other less. Innovation is also an uncertain activity, and actually you can have different layers or levels, if you want, kind of a staircase where you go from more uncertain innovation-related activity to less uncertain, for instance, the deployment of solutions that have been already tested but not yet used on the green field. So you can see that the innovation is a broad concept. It's not homogeneous, and this inevitably have consequences for researchers, but also for regulators that eventually need to promote it. Regarding the fact that innovation, do we miss it or not in the network sector? Well, as I said, the energy sector has often been perceived, at least until some years ago, as a laggard in terms of innovation. In the post-liberalization era, there was a significant decline in spending in R&D, and also a decline in the number of patents submitted. So two KPI, if you want, two proxies for innovation, one on output and one on input. And this suggested that network companies and more in general energy utilities were not investing enough in innovation, and various reasons were proposed to justify that. At the same time, it's interesting to note, and the data from also a report by the European Patent Office also seems to confirm, we can see that innovation is more and more migrating outside energy companies, but it's still there. Simply, it's no more the larger vertically integrated companies of the past performing it, but maybe it's mostly these original equipment manufacturers that innovate, especially in terms of technology. But still, let's say there is this concern. Then let's look, and I know that I will really fly over because we have little time. Let's think about how network companies can innovate. Which role can they play in innovation? And here in the chapter, we see clearly two areas, if you want. Network companies can innovate in their own business, and they did so over the past years, or they can enable system innovation by other actors of the energy system. In the first category, clearly, we can see the development of smart grids, so digitalization applied to the physical networks that can better control, monitor and control, especially smaller assets, but also super grids. And now you may have heard about these meshed grids in alternating and direct ranked offshore in order to better collect and transport electricity from offshore wind farms. But also innovation in the business, in the network business, is materialized in terms of new approaches to public acceptance, because this is something that more and more good companies are challenging, are struggling with, and we see changes in the practices, in the organizational methods that they follow in order to engage local communities. And the second category here, the enabling the support provided by network companies for innovation by other parties has been huge. No time, but just maybe an example, aggregation. Really, the definition of all the network codes over the past decades or so in Europe allow now more and more smaller units of distributed energy resources to be aggregated and offered on the wholesale market or intermittent renewables. Then maybe the final parts of the chapter look at, okay, we see that the network companies can innovate in their business, or they can support innovation by other actors in the energy sector. But still, how can we push, in case we need even further network companies to innovate? And here we provide some examples in the chapter. We have some options. First, we can change the mandate of network companies, or we can threaten to change the mandate of network companies in order to stimulate them to innovate and to do better their business, or to take over new activities. System operation, some team and also Christine already mentioned the possibility to unbundle or not. The management of energy consumer data. We can also regulate commercial activities. Some of network companies are also involved in market-based activities that can be subject to regulation in order to steer their behavior, their investments. Then one aspect that really has been researched quite extensively recently is the financial incentives. We can provide input or output-based incentives to companies to innovate. There are some problems sometimes with that. For instance, output, well, you need to identify metric, a KPI that measure innovation, and maybe this is not so trivial. And second, especially if you look at input-based incentive, but I would say also output-oriented, you remember I mentioned the fact that activities have not all the same level of certainty. Sometimes the results of innovation activities is very unpredictable. And in that case, probably cost pass-through or innovation grants from the public are a better way to provide financial incentives to network companies. And finally, we close the chapter with one remark on the last option. You know, you can give incentives, but sometimes simply network companies are not allowed by their rules to innovate and to test new solutions. For instance, because there are specific rules protect consumers, residential consumers. And in this case, a way to promote innovation is regulatory leeway. And the typical example that nowadays everybody talk about is regulatory sandboxes. So we close the chapter with a few reflections about it. And with this, it's all. You can read the chapter for more. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola, and all the speakers for this great overview of their chapters. I see some questions are popping up in the Q&A box. Please continue. And before we answer them, I want to give the floor to Nico for his reflections. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you, Marjan, and thank you to all the speakers. I found the different topics very interesting and also very relevant, because if I look at the work that Acer is doing now to implement regulation, then we have recently published our recommendation on the demand response network code that deals with how to enable access to the market of smaller distributed flexibility, I would say, with smaller demand response participating in the markets. We have work ongoing in helping the planning
of national network development plans at distribution level. That's something that is going to come out very soon, which is also very important. A third element that I would highlight is the digitalization and the smartening, the data hubs, which connect a lot with cybersecurity. Also on that one, Acer was involved in the network code on this important topic. And then last, I would connect it to the user perspective, those who use the networks and that need to receive signals to help them show behavior that is helping the system. And on this, of course, Acer is issuing these best practice reports that Tim was referring to. That's to give a signal to the users, but also signals to the system operators through our reports on revenues. And on this, we're going to work in the coming year on a report that will look more at the distribution level, since this is a new topic that has been added in the recent update of the electricity regulation. It would be the first time that we look into that level. But what it shows is that the distribution level is getting more and more attention. So very relevant. So I think it's very timely that these topics are discussed also from the academic side to help bring these insights to the wider public. Yet I have some questions, I think, for all the participants here and maybe also for the audience. They can be inspired. But one overall reflection question that I have is, what kind of DSO landscape could we expect in the future following this energy transition? We seem to expect a lot of the DSO in system operation, in more methodological network planning, also in data management, but also Christine highlighted, and also Tim, this very diverse landscape. So I would be interested to hear from them how they see this evolution, what kind of DSO landscape would we need to make it through the energy transition, and what kind of considerations could be there.
Thank you, Nico. So maybe we can start with this question, and then if you have more, we continue. So I don't know if Tim or Christine, who wants to go first in answering Nico's. Christine, please.
Okay, so should I? Well, I mean, in the chapter, we very much look at it from the perspective that the DSO in the future will be, or it looks like it will be more of a managing DSO, in the sense that maybe sometime in the very much in the past, it could have been I mean, not really passive, but very focused entity that was just building infrastructure for a demand that they could somehow still predict quite accurately. And now it seems that that's not how they will act in the future. They will have to, well, maybe not develop themselves, but at least be a part of the development of mechanisms and structures that can actually manage all these different elements in the grid and provide these transactional agreements and help shape them so that the different users in the grid will react to the needs of the grid and interact with the grid, maybe also to make innovations. And then it comes back to Nicolo, to make innovations possible. Like they can only flourish and develop to an extent that the DSO has at least been part of providing a framework or providing some kind of basis on which they can grow. So that is definitely something that we would need. And then I don't remember if it was Tim or Nicolo, you already raised this point, how if they are ownership integrated with other elements of the value chain, that might be difficult because they could could have some natural incentives for discriminating between their own integrated entities and so on. So that's obviously something that in those frameworks where that is the case, we need to be careful about. And here I'm straying away from my specific chapter, but I think that even in a setting where there is some kind of integration between the grid and other steps of the value chain, this can, to some extent, be handled by regulation, and that's maybe where Acer comes in as well. Because anyways, those are regulated entities, so they have to follow some rules, and there can also be steps of appeal if someone feels they are being discriminated and rules are not equally fair for everybody. And then I see in this shift that we describe in the chapter, you can also see how the competitive realm and the regulated realm are moving closer together anyways. And you can see that, for example, with storage, where the grid will need storage to some extent, but storage also develops in the competitive realm. So differentiating those things so nicely and sort of have this piece of having an organizational structure which really differentiates these things, I think that's not viable in the future anyway. So you will, in any case, have to have some kind of regulation, some framework that deals with these overlaps of competitive and regulated realm. And then you might as well also use that for this managing position that I could see the DSOs being in. And that's going to be my answer. It's already quite long.
Thank you, Christine. Tim, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think a lot was already said. I think it's just very important that it becomes a real digital company, which might be already the case in some countries, but definitely not in others. That means, of course, everybody talks about smart meters. I think it's incredible that some countries still don't have smart meters to a large extent, considering the benefits there. But it's not only smart meters, it's also smart grids. And that can create then smart tariffs, local system operation. Many DSOs, I think, at least that I talk to, they don't really have that good visibility at local level. And considering the amount of investment that has to come, there is real need for data to sort of show that needs case, to think about alternatives. It's not only about efficiency, it's also about reliability and accuracy. The example I always put is the Texas storm in 2021, when they were sort of had this massive brownouts where sort of half of the load could actually not be served. What they did was sort of, okay, that neighborhood doesn't get electricity for 10 hours or even 2 days in some cases, and the other neighborhood can get it like as much as they want. People died. But if you have a smart system, you could just say, okay, we know where the flows go. We give everybody for the next week access to 2.5 kilowatt. And that's more than enough to survive. And the amount of money that is wasted in those 1 week or 1 day, think about the Spanish case as well, is enough to justify many of those investments already. And we really, in a sort of more renewable world, cyber security, war kind of thing, you really need to think about those things as well. And they become efficiency when you consider the cost of not doing it. And that means, yeah, it needs to be an unbiased company, and it probably needs to be big enough. That comes to my point of the smaller ones. We already see that at transmission level. I mean, there's the talk of the RCCs, regional system operation. Well, you could think it's time to level up as well at distribution level. So yeah, that would be my thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. So maybe before I go back to, maybe Nicolas, you would like to add anything?
A very quick comment.
Sure.
I see, like Christina and Tim, the reasons to try to consolidate the DSO landscape in order to have DSOs that are able to invest, to digitalize, to also become at sufficient distance from the competitive segments of the supply chain, so generation and supply. But I also see it's quite difficult to touch the current arrangements, especially for the ownership. Just to share with you that in Italy, DSO concessions were recently prolonged, extended for 20 years. So they should have been subject to auctions in 2030. And recently there was this idea to wait another 20 years. So it's really difficult to change the ownership arrangements of DSOs. There are a lot of money involved, a lot of also municipalities or local governments that own shares of those DSOs, at least in some parts of Europe. Maybe an idea is to preserve the current ownership arrangements, but try to, from a functional, from an activity point of view, try to facilitate aggregation. And again, in Italy, a lot of the small DSOs already formed a kind of associations, referring to Alto Adige, Südtirol, for instance, where they are able to get involved in more sophisticated activities, but keeping a fragmented ownership of the various individual DSO networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. So maybe before we go back to Nico, unless you have some burning questions that you would like to ask, I have maybe like one question from the audience that we can take, and it's for all of you. So Marcin, hopefully I didn't butcher the name, is asking, on June 2nd, the European Commission presented a guidance document on anticipatory investments for developing forward-looking electricity networks. There are big hopes related to anticipatory investments. Do you already have any views on this? Whoever wants to go first, welcome.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially, I mean, at both voltage levels, but at transmission, the current, and we're not talking transmission too much here, but the current coordination between generation that is built so much faster than networks is really creating lots of trouble. So to have that idea of Texas again, where they had in the Panhandle, we build out lots of networks, the wind will come. Same in Australia with the energy zones we built into the outback, and then solar and wind will come, because that creates a lot of investment, I mean, certainty, and a lot of other like issues that you don't have with congestion and all these connection queues and all that stuff. At distribution level, I think there's a bit of danger of course we got to build out networks, but we also really have to watch out that we don't build too much, because business as usual has really been, let's just build out, build out, build out. So there's some tension there between anticipatory investment and sort of efficiency, if you want. And maybe at transmission, I forgot offshore, where I think we already did that sort of anticipatory investment in some cases, and that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Tim. Anyone else? Christine.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a position that has been part of discussions already. So in a sense, any kind of investment is anticipatory of some future revenue, right? You wouldn't invest if you wouldn't. So the difference here is that we're talking about some additional layer of uncertainty. And even though we cannot really be as certain as we want to be, we still want to invest, right? That's the situation that both at transmission and distribution level they find themselves in. And I very much agree with Tim that there's a difference between the large investments we're facing at a transmission level and things that are happening at distribution level, because it's not just a matter of efficiency. If there is now a too nice framework, if you will, and I'm ready for the shitstorm from the industry there. If there's a too nice framework for anticipatory investments at the distribution level, we might miss out on some of that managing, integrating, and all this system perspective that we also talk about in our chapter, because this will essentially not just save on investments or grid capacity that is being built, but it will help to really manage and integrate the system better. So what we need now is not just investment, and then you can discuss, is it a capital intensive investment or an OPEX investment, but we also need, these kind of transaction agreements and a different framework. And we really have to make sure to have that in place and have that well integrated with additional opportunities we give to refinance investments in the future. So it's really a matter of investing in the right things at this point. And that can also mean investing in systems rather than infrastructure to an extent.
Maybe one statistic that I should have added, like if you look at, and GRC does this data, if you look at the utilization of distribution networks, the total kilowatt or megawatt build versus the megawatt hours that go through them, you're at something between 10 and 20% if you're lucky. So there's so much space in those networks. And of course, some usage, you just want to do it. You don't care. But there's so much new usage that is coming that has that sort of, I don't care whether my car charges at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m., right? And that's really the danger, because there's so much capacity out there in many of the networks.
Thank you.
Just
Tim.
not at the right time always.
Nicola, No?
No, I think
Okay.
they exhausted the.
Yes, no, because I have a follow-up question here from Nigel. Tim spoke about the risk of DSOs building out excess network hardware, white elephants. Are there any examples you know of where anticipatory investment has not been efficient or used and needed?
I have one for this, but it's not for networks, it's for generation. In the 70s, in the US, electric utilities subject to regulation were seeing skyrocketing electricity demand growth, and they built tons, or they started to build tons of new nuclear power plants. But then with the economic crisis of the late 70s, the price increase, the call for energy efficiency and so on, several of these power plants turned out to be useless in the 80s. And it is about generation and not networks. But there in the US, there was a lot of litigation because, of course, utilities wanted to get the money back out of the investments, even though they were not used and useful with the benefit of backside. Of course, we need always to strike a delicate balance between wanting to provide a clear incentive to build and maybe the risk to pay too much for nothing if the state of the world completely change in 10 or 15 years.
Thank you, Nicola. So maybe
okay. No, I would just add very briefly, I think the question sort of comes at it from, well, not the wrong angle, but from not the angle that I would take, because there is an interaction between what you invest in and how you instead change the framework. And since we don't really have an alternative world where the framework has been changed and flexibility and a different type of network use has really been facilitated, the investments that we've seen in the past are mostly probably used and useful. But you would have to consider how else we could be using the network if there hadn't just been abundant capacity and people still had flat network tariffs and things like that. So just by pointing out that the assets we currently have are still being used, that doesn't mean we've done everything right or we couldn't have done things better already.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine. Maybe Nico, would you like to add anything? Short question or just your thoughts?
Maybe a short question, because we heard a lot now that there is still capacity available potentially if there are users that can adapt their behavior. And it's maybe a question first for Nicola, but the others can come in. What kind of regulation or financial incentives can help system operators, and maybe in particular DSOs, to look into the non-wire solution that can be an alternative to raising capacity by building?
Thank you, Nico, for the question. Well, there is a big discussion on this going on, and really the idea is to link the incentive for network companies, not only on the capital investments, but the total expenditure. So considering in the same way operating expenditure and capital expenditure, because operating expenditure is exactly the cost of procuring some flexibility services on the few hours where you need to manage a very stressful peaks in the network. This is one way, let's say, input-based, because you link to the cost. You may also imagine additional incentives related to the output. So again, you need to find clever indicators that represent the benefits of a better utilization of the existing assets, and then attach to these indicators some additional incentives that can usually come on top of, let's say, the main cost recovery for the utility. And there are some experiments with this. We made even a proposal in a study for Acer last year, so people can refer to it, are invited to refer to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. We have maybe one short minute if Tim or Christine want to add anything to this. No? Okay, perfect. Thank you all. Thank you, the speakers, Christine, Nico, Tim, and Nicola for their expertise and for engaging with us today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions in the chat box, but the time is limited. If you want to learn more, I really encourage you to take a look at the Handbook of Electricity Regulation and other FSR resources that are on our website. And so thank you all again, and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.